So, welcome to today's session, and that's a big welcome to everybody here on behalf of the Project Zero Sydney Network. And as I hope you all know, we are incredibly excited today to offer you this live webinar, and it features our friends Ron Ritchhart and Mark Church, who will be discussing with us their new book, The Power of Making Thinking Visible. And before we turn to Ron and Mark, if you haven't heard of Project Zero Sydney Network before, we're a network of educators inspired by Project Zero ideas from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And I guess at the core of our mission at Project Zero Sydney Network is to share our passion for Project Zero ideas by providing free professional learning opportunities for interested educators. And originally, of course, our mission was to do that for educators in Sydney, and then it expanded to Australia. And as today's session seems to indicate, we're expanding to the world. So we're absolutely delighted to be able to offer this, this service for everybody here. My name's Simon Brooks, and I'm one of the members of the steering committee of the Project Zero Sydney Network. And along with my friend Ryan Gill, we'll be the host for today's session. Ryan, perhaps it's a good time now for you to say hi to everyone.
Yeah, hi everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be hosting on behalf of the committee at Project Zero Sydney Network. As Simon said, we've obviously come into this space in terms of a webinar, but we're reaching far more people than we ever have. So it's an absolute pleasure to be hosting today, and looking forward to, of course, hearing from these two incredible people right here on screen.
Yeah, folks, we've prepared a lot of questions to ask Mark and Ron today, but we would love you guys to be involved as well. So as you're listening along today, we invite you to use that chat function. And if any questions come to you during the process of today, please feel free to share those to the chat. We might not be able to pose all of those questions to Ron and Mark, but we'll do our best to represent some of those as much as possible. Oh, and I know there's bound to be a lot of Twitter fans out there, so we encourage you to get tweeting. And if you'd like to do so, please use the hashtag PZSyd for your tweets so that everybody can follow along. So that's hashtag PZSYD is what we'd invite you to use. So without further ado, let's turn to the main event, and we're going to welcome Ron and Mark to today's session. Ron Ritchhart is a senior research associate and principal investigator at Harvard Project Zero, and his work there focuses on the development of school and classroom culture as prime vehicles for developing students as powerful thinkers and learners. Ron's research and writings have informed the work now of so many schools and school systems and museums around the world. And along with Ron today, we have double trouble. We're delighted also to have Mark with us. And Mark Church has been in education now for over 25 years, first as a classroom teacher and then as a facilitator of learning for other teachers and school leaders. And Mark's currently a consultant with Harvard Project Zero's Making Thinking Visible and Cultures of Thinking initiatives. And in his work there, inspires schools and educators around the world with his insight and with his thought-provoking facilitation. And of course, along with Ron, Mark is co-author of the 2011 bestseller Making Thinking Visible, and now of its 2020 companion volume, The Power of Making Thinking Visible. And of course, it's that we're here today to dig into just a little more. So Ron and Mark, we're utterly delighted and honored to have you here with us today. So let's get started. And Ryan, I'm going to pass over to you for the first question.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. It was some time ago now. I mean, over the last 10 years, I've been experiencing lots of ideas that I've connected with both of you. And it was really the book, Making Thinking Visible, as Simon suggested, that really helped popularize the ideas around thinking routines in schools and classrooms, and now in many other settings, which is just wonderful to see around the world. I'm really wondering about this book. I've got it here. You can see it up on screen. What prompted you to write this new book?
Well, the first book, The Making Thinking Visible, was our chance to really begin to kind of introduce the routines and the idea of thinking at a larger scale kind of around the world. But in those intervening years, Mark and I and other colleagues at Project Zero have continued to work with thinking routines, and we continue to learn around that. And so, with Mark, really over several years, we kept talking about, I think we've got enough things for a new book. We were learning a lot more about how teachers were using the thinking routines, about what they looked like, and we were also learning a lot more about kind of the effect they had on schools, on teachers, and on students. So that was one reason we're doing it. Mark?
Yeah, and I think the second thing in that, Ryan, is, well, certainly we've developed new routines, so the new book captures a lot of new routines that we've developed, but also others that we work with have developed. So we wanted to make sure that we put those out there for those who are really interested in making thinking routine in the classroom. I think something else that always strikes me as rather important to say, it's not like we wrote a book and then people started making their students thinking visible. It's kind of the other way around. For the first book, really interested in, certainly we had some ideas that we were being developed and tested and things like that, but we were just really inspired by teachers who really took a stance to make students thinking visible. And so then over these subsequent years, we've just seen a lot of teachers who kind of take the ideas, grow legs to them, and give us a greater window into just what is possible when students have a place in a space to get what's inside their heads out. And so our book is not a prescription piece, if you will. It really is a reflection. We've noticed this out there, and we want to reflect on that here so that people can take those ideas and even grow more legs to them. So I think that's kind of important to kind of acknowledge about the writing that we try to do.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's important, isn't it? Because very often we wonder about where these ideas are coming from. But as you said there, it's actually a reflection on classrooms, on teachers' practice. You guys being inspired by those. Can you just tell us a little bit more about how you go about developing thinking routines when you see something within a classroom?
Well, one of the ways that we often start is, we look at some kind of learning situation, some kind of learning context, and then we kind of backward design that process. We think about, well, what kind of thinking really needs to happen in this situation for students to not just be successful at work, but actually be successful in understanding the content and engaging with it deeply. And so we look at that and then think, how do we backwards engineer that so that we kind of create very simple scaffolds, kind of for that process. I think a really good example of what that process can look like, I was working with a group of teachers at a school in Melbourne, and I worked with these teachers for a number of years, so they were familiar with a lot of the routines. And I was wanting to introduce something, not a new routine, but to delve into a concept. And I knew, I could use chalk talk. That's something that would work. But the teachers were very familiar with that. And I said, I want to do something a little bit different. So that's kind of how the making meaning routine kind of came about. I kind of thought about, well, okay, what is it I want them to do with this concept? How can they begin to unpack that? How can I help structure some conversations around that unpacking? How can I help them raise questions? And how can I help them then really think about their understanding at that moment? And from that, I just kind of tried out kind of a series of steps and processes that I guided them through. And then afterwards, someone said, "Oh, is this a routine?" And I said, well, let me think about that. I think it certainly could be. And then just began to formalize those steps, try them out in a couple of situations. So often it is that context, but it is always kind of putting the learners first and putting the thinking first.
Yeah, something I was thinking on that front too, if I may just jump in there too. I was thinking about the colleague that's highlighted in one of the new routines in the book called Be Sure To. This was a teacher who was part of a summer design team, really trying to put together units for the upcoming school year. And she was thinking it's all well, fine and good if I understand what students are supposed to understand, and tell them what they should be doing. But do I have a sense that my students know for themselves how to set their own direction? So rather than me tell them what to be sure to do, I started asking them, what's one or two things that you want to be sure to do now that you know this? To be sure to. She found herself asking that over and over again, and thus it was a move she was requiring of students that she wanted to grow them into. Thus, you got a routine on your hands rather than just a clever activity for a one-shot, one-time sort of deal. So that's another kind of thing that we think about. Are there certain moves that we want students to make routinely to empower them? And so that's where routines come from.
That's really interesting, Mark. It really encapsulates for me the shift that was made between making thinking visible, creating cultures of thinking, and now coming back to some of those bigger ideas and how these routines are not playing out in isolation, but how they're playing out in a broader scope of learning and teaching. How about you guys just say a little bit more about that?
Well, I think that that again is also something that we try to do in this book. At Project Zero, we always are trying to make our research, our ideas, quite available to folks. We don't put things behind paywalls. So recently, they just launched a toolkit with lots of thinking routines in there. But what we kept seeing, Mark and I, in all of the context, and probably, for you, Simon, and Ryan as well, that sometimes teachers will use the routines and it'll just be like an activity. And so you've got the routine there and you've got the basic steps. But what we felt we wanted to do was, again, as you just mentioned there, Ryan, put these in context to have some really rich pictures of practice that really take you through that decision-making process of what does that look like? What was on the teacher's mind? And how did the teacher kind of, deal with, students taking it one direction or students struggling? Where did they adapt? How did they do things? So we really wanted to contextualize these routines in the book. And that's one of the big reasons for having it in a book rather than just, handing people a set of routines.
Yeah, Ron and Mark, I imagine that in our audience today, we've got a broad range of folks with varying different degrees of familiarity with these ideas. There'll be some people here who have been immersed in Project Zero ideas for 10 to 20 years, others who have a fair degree of experience with these ideas, and there could well be some folks who are pretty new to all of this. So with those folks in mind now, I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about what is a thinking routine, just sort of take it back to that for us. And then for teachers who are new to these thinking routines, what are some of the things that they need to watch out for? What cautions or tips have you got for us?
Well, I'll start in on that if I may, Ron. And, when we think about a routine, so how do they differ than strategies or activities? An activity may be, we're going to watch this video and have a discussion, and that activity will come and go. I'm not going to continue to do that over and over and over again for the rest of the school year. But a routine is imagining what are certain moves, in particular thinking moves, that I want students to get really, really good at, so much so that they do it routinely, regularly, just normal. So if I want students to look closely at something, if I want them to develop theories, if I want them to reason with evidence, not just that special time that we have on Friday if we get to the rest of the work this week, but if I want looking closely and making connections and wondering and perspective seeking to be something that they do routinely, then I have to ask myself, where does it live in the day-to-day? So a short answer, even though it's kind of gone a little long already, relatively speaking, but we think about tools or routines as tools that get used over and over again. We think about them as structures that give space for students to get what's inside their heads and get it out. But ultimately, we think about these tools and structures becoming patterns of behavior. So many know from the first book, and there will be many in the audience that would be familiar with the sort of the ubiquitous or the pinnacle routine, see, think, wonder. There is see, think, wonder, the routine, but it's seeing, thinking, wondering as routine. And for so there's a big difference there. See, think, wonder, the routine, or getting my students to see and think and wonder as routine. For the newcomers, and then I'll toss over here to Ron. For newcomers to this, I can tell you what's not new here for you. So this is where maybe you can just think about for yourself, what kinds of behaviors have I ever tried to get kids good at? And what systems did I put in place to help kids get good at that behavior? For example, my first year teaching, I had 9-year-olds, and I was fresh out of university. I'm ready with my first class, and it was so exciting. And that last bell rang for my first day teaching ever. And those kids almost trampled me down at the classroom door. I thought I was going to lose my life in my own classroom. It was just a horrible way to end the day in terms of the unruliness of it. So I said to myself, that can't happen for the rest of this school year. We need to have sort of a closing down routine, not just to everybody throw everything down and rush out of the room. So we put our things back in the bins go back on the shelf, the plastic bins, the trays, if you will. We line up and then we exit. We practiced it once, we practiced it twice, and then it just became routine. We just did that. That became just our ritual, if you will. Right? Now that's a behavior management routine, but we think about routines, thinking routines in the same way. What kind of thinking behavior do we want to make ritual that students can do it regularly? So much so that if I have to have my class covered by Ryan, I could say to Ryan, just have the kids do that. They'll know what they're supposed to do. So that's the familiar territory for people. People put routines in place because there's behaviors they want kids to get good at. So, and Ron, did you want to add anything or?
I think you did an excellent job of explaining all that. The one kind of small bit that I might add is, in parallel to what you were saying is, when we think about thinking routines, one reason why they are so important is, in many times they will help make visible and concrete something that good students are doing automatically. So for example, a routine like, connect, extend, challenge. Well, a good reader, or a very effective learner, they're reading a text, they're connecting it to what they already know. They're asking themselves, well, what's new here? What are those new parts? They're asking themselves, well, what am I confused by? What do I know? They're just doing that as a matter of course. And so by naming it as a routine and having it as a tool and being explicit about it, we can get that into that student that may not be doing it automatically. Because sometimes teachers will say, these routines seem so obvious, or yeah, I do that. Well, that's good actually. But by making it explicit, you then are helping other students that don't necessarily do that automatically. You're adding the structure to that. And so you are developing the students as thinkers and learners.
Yeah, you're both making me think about something that I learned years ago from talking with both of you, which is this idea that, of course, thinking routines have such power as just as one-off activities, but the power goes far beyond that. And I remember Mark saying to me many years ago that it's not so much about using thinking routines as it is about making thinking routine, and that these routines are structures that enable us to make that happen, that habitualize particular patterns of thinking in our classrooms. And so you've got me wondering then, as a sort of follow-up to that, is, so how do we as teachers make decisions about what type of thinking that we want to make routine in our classrooms?
Well, ultimately you're looking at the content that you're teaching, and you are asking yourselves, well, what does it take to actually grapple with this content? And I mean, even content's perhaps not the best word. I was just reading some research today saying, when teachers focus on big ideas, then it's easier for them to think about, well, what is it that goes into grappling with those big ideas? What's the thinking I need students to do? If teachers only focus on content, there's a tendency like, oh, I delivered this, tomorrow I'll deliver this, the next day I'll deliver this. So when we think about what are those bigger ideas that I'm wanting to have students, what's that big conceptual understanding? What are the disciplinary understanding that I'm trying to develop with students? So, it's very difficult to teach science if students aren't reasoning with evidence. And making those interpretations there. It's very difficult to teach history if you aren't grappling with perspectives with that. So, sometimes it's very clear a type of thinking that really jumps out in a particular discipline. And then you look at the other kinds of thinking that are also really important. And we developed, at the outset of this project, of visible thinking, which began in the year 2000. One of our first steps was to put together what we called the understanding map, which was a way of helping to articulate for teachers what kind of thinking is really necessary in order to, thanks for putting that up. Yeah, so what kind of thinking is really necessary to help students as they are developing understanding with any particular kind of topic. So that's a very good place to kind of start.
And one of the things I would add on it, Simon, if I could, you asked the question, how do teachers decide what kind of thinking to build routines around or to promote in the classroom? That question makes me think, well, how are they making decisions about what kind of thinking they're promoting already? Like now, there is this idea, like every classroom, there is some kind of cognitive moves being required. Now, whether we're articulate around that or not, whether we're intentional around that or not, that's another question. But it's not like, and so that's why sometimes when I hear teachers say, I like all this thinking stuff, but I have a lot of content to teach. I'm always trying to listen to the next part of that sentence. I've got a lot of content to teach, and the thinking moves that I shall require or encourage or leverage shall be ... I'm always listening for that. Don't always hear it, but just because I don't hear it doesn't mean a certain type of thinking isn't already being privileged. And so, I don't know, maybe I'm cashing in currency with the group right now to kind of put that provocative thought out there on a Saturday morning in Australia, but it's still Friday afternoon for me. So I guess I'm okay. Sorry for those of you who are just drinking your morning tea. But I do think if I don't have any kind of intention about the thinking that I want students to do, I could easily just run this activity, and the only role for my students could be fill in, give back. And I don't think anybody on this call would desire that. I really don't think teachers intend for that to happen, but it could be the case. And so that's where it's just our work. We're hoping to not only give people good practices, if you will, and I'll stop sharing my screen, but we also want to kind of put out the idea in this book that making thinking visible isn't just a set of practices, but it's a goal. What kind of thinking moves will help make this material accessible and will serve these students well. And when whatever role a student is asked to do the most, that's the role they're going to get good at. So that's maybe another thing to maybe address some of the stuff you were just raising there, Simon.
Yeah, you've got me making connections back to this core idea that learning is a consequence of thinking. And if we're in the business of helping children develop understanding, then thinking's kind of a non-negotiable, right? It's we've got to put thinking front and center in all of its different forms to develop that understanding. Yeah.
I mean, so again, that focus on understanding, when teachers come up to us, at a workshop and say, yeah, but where would I use this? Or I don't know how to use this in my, subject area. Our first question is always, well, two questions. The one is, well, what do you want students to understand? And then, okay, and what kind of thinking is required for that? And if teachers can answer that, then yeah, we can help them. But if they can't answer that, there's a big issue. Again, as we're just kind of talking about the content, this research that I was reading today, the study showed that when teachers focused on content, if students struggled, the teacher's response was to simplify the content. When teachers focused on understanding and thinking, then when students struggled, they thought about, how do I scaffold the thinking? And so I think that beautifully kind of describes kind of how we situate thinking routines. They are those scaffolds for the thinking that students need to grapple with the rich disciplinary and conceptual understanding.
I think that's so powerful, Ron. I really do. And there's so many things that we could pick out of what you said. We've talked a lot about using thinking routines, of course, and you've touched upon other areas that are detailed in the book. But this obviously is not just called Making Thinking Visible. It's called The Power of Making Thinking Visible. So it leads me to think, what are those powers that you so heavily structured this new book with, and how do we distinguish between just using thinking routines, which I think really Mark touched upon there, and making thinking visible? How do we bridge that divide that so often teachers do sometimes struggle with?
Kind of a two-part question there. So let me start with the kind of the first part there, and Mark, please jump in at any point. That so part of the research for this book was to be in classrooms, interview teachers about, well, what difference is this making? And so we did identify, 6 very specific, powers that we noticed that these, both we noticed and it kept coming up in the interviews with teachers. So, and some of these, we certainly kind of knew off the bat, but it was nice to kind of hear them reiterated. So one is the idea of engaging students. That we heard that over and over again, that teachers would say, like, well, when I'm using the routines, I see them engaged. And it's not just engaged in the activity, but it's cognitively engaged. It's engaged with the content. It's engaged with each other in a very meaningful kind of discussion around that content. Another one was around deep learning. And again, that connects to the conversation we've been having around that disciplinary understanding, that kind of conceptual understanding. That's what it means to kind of go deeply. And teachers felt like, we get so much deeper by using the routines. Another one is kind of the changing role of the teacher and the student. And that one was really interesting to see, because people didn't just kind of, name that as, oh, my role's changing, but teachers began to say things like, I find myself listening more and talking less. I look for opportunities to create that student agency, and my students are ready for that sense of agency. They're ready to kind of step forward. I find myself more flexible with my curriculum. So we kind of label that under that kind of changing role. Mark, you want to jump in there and talk about some of the other ones?
Yeah, well, a couple other things came to mind, but I was also thinking about, teachers I've worked with in Australia in the past, at schools where both of you were, Brian and Simon. I'm pretty good at making the thinking visible, but then what? And that's a natural question for a lot of folks, right? It isn't just making thinking visible, just as we've been saying on this call, and we've said in many forums, not just as something to jazz up a lesson plan, but how does making my students thinking visible via a routine or via other practices like what I'm listening for, what we're documenting, the questioning, how is it giving me a window into my students and what they're understanding, but also a window into myself and where I might take them? So it's sort of that formative assessment bit. I remember a young teacher I worked with he was a geography teacher, I believe, in St. Ives, who once said, at first I thought making thinking visible was going to take so much time, but then I realized it helped buy me back some time. If
I
that
might have
wasn't
said
you,
that.
if that wasn't you, Ryan, then I've attributed it to you, and I say it in the best ways. But it was like, yeah, to do this plus on top of everything else does seem like a big ask. But if I can see, wow, the stuff I was going to have my students do, I think they've got it already. So that just buys up a little window of time for other things that we could spend some time with. Or I've also seen this play out in other places, not just from your story, Ryan, but from others, where teachers are like, when I saw that there was a gap there, I knew we really did need to do that practice. And so that's what I think another power is. It's not routine to decorate a lesson, but it's also a routine to get a window into some insight into my students, insight into my own choices.
Yeah, it's so often the case for me when I reflect back and think about the amount of time that I spent in the classroom worrying about, as Ron said, the content in our subject areas, but then just slow down and think about those opportunities where I can ask a question that builds upon something that my student has said, or really listening carefully, thinking about those questions that you talked about. And I can see in the chat there's a number of people asking about questions. But one of the things that you touched upon there, Mark, that I'm interested in, and I don't think people will necessarily have a lot of understanding of, and forgive me, people in the chat, if we do have understanding. But you mentioned about documentation, and that's a new area that is, forgive me, documented in the book. But thinking about ways in which we can document learning. Can you just share a little bit more about that concept of documentation?
Sure. I'll just start a little bit with it, but then Ron, I want you to kind of speak towards the bigger picture of documentation and how it plays out in the larger field. I always think about documentation, like what do we need to note in this moment, so that it doesn't get lost. So I'm not thinking so much about documentation in terms of record keeping or scoring a grid, as much as when the learning is happening, just what kinds of things need to be captured so that you have those to be continued moments, so that the learners themselves, you can pull it back out and say, okay, so here's where we were. Where are we now? I used to think, now I think kind of moments. It's hard for students to be able to speak with that kind of agency or that sort of confidence if they don't know for themselves where they've been and where they're going. So I think a lot about kind of the boots to the ground, the brass tacks of what kinds of things need to be captured in this moment that will then inspire future opportunities for thinking. And also that the students then can feel like we're owning it. I think another place of documentation, like when teachers are documenting, they're trying to make meaning of what students are saying. And I think we've all been in classrooms where as soon as I hear something from a student, I need to go in there and teach it. I need to go in there and teach at that moment. So I do think the practice of documentation, I'm just going to capture all the ideas, the initial thoughts, the conceptions that are out there, the initial questions. I'm doing that as a teacher so I can listen in that moment and then make a choice. Here's where we want to bundle this. Here's where we want to move this forward. Those students said something I didn't even consider. What opportunity might I create from there? So I think about documentation in those kind of practical ways. I want to be able to use it. But Ron, you might want to say something about documentation.
Well, documentation has actually always kind of been a part of visible thinking. As we were developing these ideas, we were inspired and informed early on by some of the work of Reggio Emilia. Project Zero has had like a 35-year collaboration with Reggio Emilia. So my colleagues, Mara Kerchevsky and Steve Seidel, had always kind of talked about documentation. So early on, we thought about that idea. from a cognitive standpoint, there's also the idea of, it's called distributed intelligence, the idea that we don't do all of the thinking in our head, that we often use resources like paper and pen. We distribute things. So, you think like, oh, I don't have to keep all of this in my head. So that helps to kind of reduce cognitive load. Reggio doesn't talk about it so much that way, but we saw that that was an important thing. So we took some of the ideas from the Reggio Emilia project. One that kind of Mark has articulated there, the idea about, well, what is it that I want to capture? What is it that I want to return to? What is it that I want to have visible in my classroom so that my students can reference it? So that idea, I think, is very kind of Reggio. And then we also added on to that idea of cognitive load. I think what we've done in the new book is we've articulated more about how documentation is a really important making thinking visible practice. And when we wrote up each of the routines, one of the things that would be there in terms of the steps is, and the steps just aren't the routines themselves, but the steps are for the teacher. We always include in there like, well, how will you document this routine? And we would include in there like, this routine is kind of self-documenting. If you're doing a chalk talk or you're doing a making meaning routine, it is self-documenting. You don't have to do that. But then you think about, okay, well, sharing documentation is important. So how will you share that thinking? What part of that? So we always included that. And so that's become a much more, I think, a present part of our thinking currently.
We've got, sorry, you carry on, Mark.
Well, I was just going to say, because I made reference to our colleague Julie's use of Be Sure To, which we captured in this new book. But I just remember when I was talking with her and trying to write up sort of her experience with that routine, Be Sure To. It was important for her to empower students. I want to know if they can set their own direction. And then I want to wrap my teaching around the directions they set, what they want to be sure to do to improve their writing in the case that she was working within. But I remember her saying that I made, her being the teacher, I made a choice not to collect their 2 Post-it notes because I wanted to keep it in their hands. So that was another way of like asking the students, what do you need to document? And keeping it in their hands. And that was another empowering move. At least that's what the choice that she made. Of course, whenever she saddled up alongside of them to conference with them, then, okay, show me what you wanted to be sure to do. Let's start there. And again, I think that's kind of another interesting sort of power of making thinking visible, the role of the student, the role of the teacher, the formative assessment in that. And also, developing thinking dispositions of reflections and connections and so on and so forth. So anyway, you had some other questions. I'm sorry.
No, please don't apologize. And sort of taking stock of our conversation, we've been talking about some of those practices of making thinking visible, such as documentation. And we know we've got listening and questioning as well. And we've also been talking about some of those thinking routines already, and we've made reference to Be Sure To and to making meaning. There's a question that's come in from one of our attendees today that I thought I might offer to you both. And so here it is. The question is, from the broad range of thinking routines available, do you find that any lend themselves particularly to more deeper learning than others?
I would probably, again, as we articulated, that one of the powers is really around deeper learning. So we do think that thinking routines do lend themselves, all of them lend themselves to that deeper learning. But one thing I might kind of might be useful in answering that question is, thinking routines are always a marriage between the routine, the structure, and the content. So if you have really weak content, the thinking routine isn't going to elevate it and make it deep. Like I was in a classroom once and they were doing See, Think, Wonder, and it was one of those posters of like a bunch of kittens in a basket. It's kind of like, there's nothing really very deep to see, think, and wonder here about a bunch of kittens, sitting in a basket. The routine couldn't elevate that really weak content. But you put strong content and you take the routine, and the routine then will elevate it there. So when we talk about that deeper learning, think about that marriage. It's really, really rich content, which is often complex, often has some degree of ambiguity. It requires some grappling with it. Marry it with the routine, and that's what's going to take you deeper.
A particular routine that comes to mind that, when married with rich content, might really facilitate some deep learning, one we might not mention today?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that last bit there. You cut out just a little, Simon.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, to go back to our friend's question, whether or not, bearing in mind what Ron's just said there about, a routine, I guess, is only as successful as the richness of the content that it's used with. But that said, is there another routine that you might like to talk about today, or showcase from the book, that really feels like it provides some rich opportunities to go deep?
Oh, certainly, most certainly. Each of the routines is designed to make certain kind of thinking moves, call them into action, if you will. So, sometimes thinking routines are asked to really require the students to look at things from another angle. Sometimes thinking routines cause them to look more closely than what they might see on the surface. I do want to suggest another routine that people might enjoy in the new book, but alongside with what Ron was saying about the marriage of the routine and the content, it's hard to do deep thinking if there's not rich content. I also think there's part of the marriage or the family there is also, the routine is only as powerful as one's purpose and the interactions to kind of pursue that purpose rather than to get the routine done. So any of our routines, any of them could easily be just fill this in, complete it, turn it in. I mean, it would break our hearts, but I don't have control over the use of the routines. So it could easily. I mean, we've seen See, Think, Wonder, a thing like that, just be very shallow or very deep. So, and then sometimes, if like the basket of kittens that Ron was just talking about, sometimes I've seen, and this maybe goes back to the advice of some new teachers or new to this idea. Sometimes people give something a try and say, oh, well, the kids didn't do very much, and well, that's not a winner, and they throw it away. But it may have been, maybe the content wasn't rich enough. Maybe it wasn't the right thinking move at that time. Maybe the teacher herself didn't do a lot of listening to push some questions back. And so I always say, give something a few tries before you throw it at the bin. One of the routines that I really like, it's a pairing of routines. I really like the 3 whys and the 4 ifs. It really is nurturing this disposition. Why does this matter? The 3 whys. And then on lots of levels. Why does, like here in the United States, we've got a lot of issues right now. But if I think about the protests we've been seeing in the streets, why does this matter? Why does this matter to me personally? Why does this matter to my community? What in this matters to the world? Why? Britain votes to leave the European Union. I know that seems like old news now, but like, why does that matter? Why does it matter to me? Why does that matter to our community? Why does that matter to the world? I like that move because I think that can push to some depth. And then I think the 4 ifs a lot of times is like, if we were thinking about protests and should people be allowed to protest, let's say, in times where COVID is running rampant. Okay, there's the 4 ifs. So the if is, if I took this issue seriously, what might that mean for me? If my community took this seriously, what might it mean for the community? If our nation took this seriously, what implications would that have? And then there's also the 4th if. And if I do nothing, If none of us do anything, then what could happen? So those are two routines in the new book that I do have a strong affinity for, and I think really lend themselves to depth if the interactions push them there.
And I think, just to carry on from what Mark was saying right there, those two routines are put together in a section of routines about engaging students in action. And I think that's something also that's really new for us. We did not really kind of think about those kinds of routines, but the more we thought about engaging kids with very kind of meaningful topics and going deeply, we thought the importance of giving them routines and structures that help them to engage in action and begin to kind of think about action. And so we've got 6 routines that kind of fit into that kind of category.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. Ryan, over to you.
I'm definitely not the right person for this because I get so drawn into you guys. I can't do too much at once. Jeez, wow. Thank you so much so far, guys. And we are running out of time, and we're not going to get in between people enjoying this and enjoy the rest of their day, their evening. One question that I think that comes up sometimes, time and time again, is that question that you touched upon, Mark. If we're thinking about how applicable the ideas are to this subject area or this subject area or this grade level to this grade level, how do we overcome that type of thinking? How might people get the best out of making thinking visible despite what subject or grade level that they teach?
You may feel like I'm being a broken record a bit, but I think I think the map that we shared, and I can throw it back up here on the screen. I think this is a great compass. You both have heard me, and a lot of people on this call would have heard me use that language of use this as an anchor and a launch pad for our ideas. Sometimes, like if a chemistry teacher says to me, I'm not going to I'll use one of the routines from the first Making Thinking Visible book right now. I'm not going to use color, symbol, image in my chemistry class. Okay, right? I don't want to get into argument around that because it's not the practice that I'm fussed about or beholden to. It's more the purpose. Think about color, symbol, image. And I'm using that one because I know if people haven't read the new book, then CSI, color, symbol, image, is very well known. That's a synthesizing move, right? That's about putting my thumb down on what's the core of this. And so that's the conversation that I want to have with that teacher, or a teacher could have with herself. It's not about doing CSI in my chemistry class. It's when does synthesizing ideas matter in my chemistry class, or with my kindergarten class or early years classroom? When does that move matter? If people kind of, you ask the question, how do you kind of get around it? It seems like then the focus is about the practices and who's got time to put more practices in. But if I've got this purpose, I want these kinds of thinking moves to become routine, then people can start chipping away. Where do these moves live in the lives of 8-year-olds that I teach, or with 12th grade writers that I teach in let's say, English language arts classroom? So this map, chapter 6 of the book, Ryan, really highlights a lot of teachers around the world, a few from Australia, some from Redlands. No, that was in What, So What, Now What? But Wayne Cox over at Newington, or he was at the time, a lot of teachers, how do they use thinking routines for maximum effect? So that would be a chapter, I think, that I would draw people's attention to. They could learn a lot from that.
I agree. So
and what I would add on to there is, in terms of helping teachers grow and to see possibilities, is just collaborating with other teachers. what we see over and over again is that when teachers get into other teachers' classrooms, when they are invited in, when they do that informally, when they're sharing, then they see possibilities that they may never expect. I mean, there's a team of accounting teachers at one of the schools I work with in Melbourne that we had set up lots of kind of what we call learning labs where we would plan together. They would go into classrooms. You know, they went into a senior English classroom. They saw the English teachers doing that. And once they saw the routine folding out, even though it wasn't their content, the two of them had an epiphany about, oh, here's how we can use that. So being in dialogue with other people, with other teachers, a colleague, whether they be in your grade, you're in your subject area or not, getting into other classrooms, you begin, once you see it on the ground, you begin to often get some new ideas and some possibilities. So that would be something I would encourage, you know, all teachers to do, to form those kinds of informal networks at their school.
One of the great things about reading a book is that lovely experience of reading a text and kind of reading yourself into it, of seeing yourself played out in the words that have been written by someone else. It's like they've managed to step inside your own experience. And that happened to me a few times whilst reading your book. And one of those moments that I know that particularly spoke to me was the section towards the end of the book where you're talking about pressing for thinking, and particularly this danger of turning watering holes into mini versions of campfires. And yeah, it kind of spoke to me because I know that that's something that I've done many times and probably still do many times as an educator. Yeah, it felt powerful to me. So I wanted to invite you to talk a little more for folks who might not have read that passage yet, what we mean by that and what the danger of that is.
Why did you start on that one?
I mean, just for people, I'll do just some unpacking, and then Mark, you can jump in there. So for people who are not familiar with those terms, you know, these are kind of archetypes of environments. So that a campfire is a large group, everyone coming together. We often think about storytelling happening around the campfire, that kind of delivery. There's a clear speaker. Watering holes, smaller gatherings, often not with a real leader. They're much more conversational. That's a kind of learning group. Another one that's not in that particular thing would be a cave where you're working individually. So those are so when we say don't turn watering holes into campfires, we're talking about, you know, that time when you've got that small huddle of learners. Don't turn it into, I'm on the stage now. So Mark, why don't you fill in the rest?
Yeah, and one of our experiences, you know, because Ron and I have been, well, with several teachers that we've worked with in Australia and other places, you know, going on learning labs or doing snapshot protocols. And, you know, something we notice over and over again, you know, a teacher has the group together in a campfire and then, okay, guys, off you go sort of thing. And then we kept seeing time and time again, teachers then immediately then jumping in with a group and then never letting the children themselves take on the very things that she just said she wanted them to take on, or he, in that matter. And so in some ways, the watering holes, the chance for the students to really take the power and exchange the ideas, kept getting interrupted by the teacher turning it back into a campfire. And I have to be very, very, just very clear to say, none of the teachers I ever observed doing that kind of move did it with bad intentions. It was this unintentional move that actually cut off the very thing of listening to the student back in the, listening to what the teacher is telling. Right, that's sort of the role of the teacher, role of the student. I wrote down a phrase down here, the unwitting undermining that I may do in my own classroom. And how willing am I to kind of look into that? You know, the blind spots of our practice are the hardest to see because, well, we're blind to them. That's why I do think that Ron's advice, being in each other's classrooms, not necessarily because it's the same subject or same grade level, but when you see others kind of working with students, you start to see yourself, like you just said, Simon. And the things that you start to see for yourself, no one can ever take that away. Something else from that chapter too, Simon, you were talking about the, don't turn the watering hole into a mini campfire. There's a colleague, Kendra Daly, she's written up in that book. She thought a lot about students' agency and empowerment. And she said, if I walk away from a group of learners, and she was working with primary school students, she said, if I walk away and the learning falls apart, then I was doing too much of the lifting. I was doing too much of the legwork. And I think that's another kind of thing for all of us, not you, Simon, not Ryan, but Ron and I. Have I done too much lifting here? And then who's got the power? So these are the kinds of things that we really wanted to capture in the back half of the book, after the routines.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's this idea, isn't it, of how might I step back a little so that they can step forward. Sort of comes to the heart of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, just a moment of pause sometimes. And I think that's the use of routines also gets me off the mic for a little bit and gets my ears open. And just even 15 seconds of pause, sometimes I get a better idea than my first reaction.
Look, time is our enemy, and it's been such a wonderful experience speaking with you both today. So I'm going to pass back over to Ryan as we move towards the end of our time together today.
It is, and there's going to be so many people out there that are going, no, we're just getting started, and it is one of those things. But we do need to give thanks. I'll wait to give thanks to these people that we have right here with us, Simon. But there's a number of people behind the scenes that we want to firstly give a huge thanks to. Simon and I, and Nigel, who's hiding his face right now, but he might just put his camera back on, because there's a committee of people, just passionate educators like ourselves, that are just looking for opportunities to share ideas that we are so incredibly passionate about. So really, on behalf of everyone at Project Zero Sydney, Nigel, we just want to say thank you to you, because you do so much behind the scenes. Everyone that's with us just now will have been given an email, will have received an email from Nigel, and the amount of hours and work that goes into organising something like this that Nigel just does so willingly is just, we're just so grateful to you, Nigel. You are certainly a treasure to us, but all of the people in the committee too, we thank you. Simon, you probably noticed already, you've been a better facilitator than I have, because like I said, I just get so zoned into what these guys are saying. So thank you for you too. Where to from here? There's lots of opportunities to share your success stories and things that you've heard and been inspired with today. Please continue to share with so many people that are on networks like Twitter and obviously our Facebook sites. We want to just highlight something that's coming up next week as well. We have not quite a follow-up, but certainly connected, an upcoming webinar that's been hosted by ourselves with the lovely Erica Lusky and Julie Rains. That's next Sunday, the 9th of August. You can book that via our website, again, free and open access. We're not selling anything here. So please jump onto the website. And last but not least, there are so many thank yous, thank you all, thank you so much. And they go to these incredible people that we have that so generously give of their time. Ron and Mark, we can't thank you enough. You are such an inspiration to every educator around the world, but certainly to us. We just want to wholeheartedly show our gratitude to you. Thank you for all that you do. Thank you for this, because it was just, we were waiting for this for so long. We're grateful. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having us. We really appreciate it. And for everything that PZ Sydney does, we think it's a wonderful organization, and it's great that you make this professional learning free to folks, not just in Sydney, New South Wales, Australia, but now kind of the world. That's fantastic.
Yeah, and I also just want to say one thing while people are still on the call. None of the teachers in this book, have found some secret of the universe or some hidden utopia that is out of reach for anybody on this call. They were all just teachers like yourselves that became very keenly interested in making space for kids thinking, and then they took some action. And so I don't want to take any magic away from them, but it's not magic. They just tried. And so I wish you well in all your attempts and efforts. I can't wait to hear where it goes with you all. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Great.
Yep.
Thank you all.
And thank you all for joining us. We will see you hopefully next weekend, next Sunday, 9th of August, earlier start, 9 a.m., but hopefully you can join us there. Cheers, guys. Take care and enjoy the rest of your day.